So moving on to the next question, maybe Kaushik, you can tackle this. Do we need a manufacturing sector? Can we have service-led growth instead and still create good jobs?
If I may take this a bit more generally, the manufacturing sector historically was treated as the big job creator. India never jumped on that bandwagon, as we know from all data. China did that magically well, grabbed the whole world's manufacturing sector. The whole economy grew. India has not done that. There is, I believe, scope for that, but there are stumbling blocks. In this whole thing about what do we do, the question is, in the end, it'll have to be actually the individual private entrepreneurs, the self-employed people, they will have to do things. So we can say that you should employ this, you should do that technology, but that's quite pointless. The question that we have to try to answer is at the level of the state, government, what kinds of interventions can get these sectors going? Now, for me, the manufacturing sector is important, and I do like the fact that that's being given a lot of stress. But the government can't do that. The government has to be an enabling force. You just create the right ethos for that, which is also true for services. And I'll come in with a little bit of global numbers. All over the world, the share of wages, the wage bill as a share of GDP, especially in upper income countries and high income countries, just collapsing around the world. Over the last 40 years, it's coming down. So there are a variety of reasons why the need for labor is going down. One of two things can happen. I'll give you one Indian data. I'm taking a period when I used to be familiar with India, which I'm not that familiar anymore, is from 2005 to 2012. It's a 7-year period. India's economy GDP was growing at 8.2% per annum, which is the fastest 7-year consecutive lap. India's not had that before. But employment was growing at 2% per annum. So this was a period where the GDP is growing very well, but employment is not growing. How do you correct that? And now there are a few things that can happen. One is it may not be possible to correct. The way the technology is coming in, there may be this crunch. You'll have to just grow much more rapidly. One thing which I'll tell you, which sounds a bit absurd, is the overall growth rate going up much more all over the world. To, let us say, crazy levels like 25% per annum, it sounds just can't happen. But if you look at pre-industrial revolution till 1820, the growth rate was, global GDP was Angus Madison's number. Those are the only things we have, 0.3%. In recent times, it's over 3%. So 10 times faster. So you couldn't have imagined the world growing like this. It's possible that will happen. We'll be going trouncing, in which case the labor force growth is smaller than GDP growth, but it's being absorbed. What should India do? I feel India will begin to feel the crunch 10 years, 15 years down the road as the workers become more expensive. But in the meantime, even if global demand for labor is decreasing, with such cheap labor available in India, do a few things, and India can still have a 10-year, 15-year run, which is a fantastic run. For that, to me, a couple of things are needed. One is infrastructure. The government enables the private sector to employ more people. Your ports are clearing faster, your transportation is faster, electricity. There's also digital technology now, because one form of employment is going to be you're working for another consumers in a faraway country, for firms in another faraway country, but you're sitting in Bangalore or somewhere else you're working. That's an advantage that we can pick up, digital connectivity. You also need basic analog support. I mean, you need water supply, you need law and order, and this sector takes off. If the government cuts down bureaucratic costs, provides infrastructural support, the advantage can be so big for rich countries. For United States, protectionism becomes so costly vis-a-vis India because there's so much cheap labor, well-connected, they can provide. If they indulge in protectionism, Germany will use this labor. It's that competition which will allow India to flow. And look back, I mean, if it sounds that I'm talking in thin air, China did exactly that. Its manufacturing sector efficiency was so great that even if individually you want to avoid China, you know another rich country is going to use China and outcompete you. So China broke into the world. I feel India is at a stage where provide a couple of these enabling factors, despite the shrinking demand for labor globally, India with its much lower cost labor can counter that. That will change 10, 15 years later. That will be a global problem of what do you do with the demand for labor going down, but we don't have to worry about that. So infrastructure, bureaucratic costs in India are very large. A couple of such things and you will energize the private sector to take up.
But there are two things, right? I mean, just to play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
One is Indian workers won't be competing with American and German workers, they will be competing with robots. And secondly, if not robots, they are competing with workers from Vietnam and Bangladesh and so on. So which way, so what are the chances, especially with the automation growing so fast? This is a problem China did not have to face, right? They came just at the right time in the technological history.
So this is a global challenge, the robotic machines. And one example I can give you is close to where I live, Ithaca, Buffalo, which was just dead in terms of the manufacturing sector, is seeing a revival. But if you look at some of their expenditure, there's something called Eastman machines. They produce such efficiently machines for textiles production. They are managing to sell to Bangladesh and Vietnam. But look at their cost structure, 3% on labor. Rest is robotic machines and other things just taking over that workplace. So I feel that pressure will be felt actually bigger by rich countries to start with, because Indian labor is so much cheaper. For the robots to replace that will take a bit of time. But I'm fully aware that India will have to face up to a problem that China did not, because within 10, 15 years we will hit that when the robots will begin to come in. One of two things can happen. If the robots are providing complementary services, wages could still rise. For instance, if half the population is doing research, they can be hitting new products and new things and still have reasonable productivity. But that is a global scenario where the world is growing at a phenomenal rate, labor is growing at a smaller rate, but if labor grows at say 2%, 3%, for India that's fine, because India's, if you look at the demographic dividend, it peaks in 2040. All estimates are that working age population to total labor is going to rise till 2040 and then begin to rise. During this period, if we can keep up about 2.5% growth in employment, so for which you need GDP growth much more rapid, you will still manage to get it. But you have to keep that up, and for that, there is a job to be done.
What do you think, Pranab?
Let me go back to your original question, which is on services. You know, again, much depends upon the institutional framework in which services are delivered. So if you think about services in the Indian context, with the exception of a few sectors, mainly finance, most of services are seen as either unorganized or individually provided. We are not talking about large-scale service companies. When you're talking about good jobs, you need those institutions in place. Now the question is, what would it take us to move from an individual-led service provision to an organization-led service provision? And do we want it? That's an unanswered question. But you're not going to get good jobs, because all of those guys would then get classified in your self-employed, unorganized self-employed category, for which you have no measure. And it could well be the case that that's the sector which is seeing the highest increase in earnings. You didn't have the figure there. But I suspect that that may well happen. But let's talk about the institutional structure and service delivery. Right? In a sense, I think that's partly happening, because what you're getting now is, whether you take healthcare, you're moving away from single doctors into hospital structures. Education has always been institutionalized and is getting more so. The problem in both these cases is the quality and the skill sets. In both cases, your skill development programs are woefully bad. So we've got all kinds of skill development that the government is pushing, but none of them in either of these two sectors. So we need to then think about, now as far as the point that Kaushik is making, I'm absolutely with him. Right? I think we have a way to go. But again, there I think we have to realize another thing, that is we've been shooting ourselves in the foot. And that is, today we have a very peculiar situation in India, where the gap between a 15-year loan and a 3-month loan is less than half a percentage point. So what are you doing? You're essentially telling companies, instead of paying labor, which is what forms your working capital cost, just buy a machine. It doesn't cost you that much more. If you look at countries who are in similar levels of development, the gap between working capital loans and long-term borrowings would be 2.5 to 3 percentage points. We are operating at less than a half. Now, this is a policy mistake. This has absolutely nothing to do with the economic structure. It's just that we have a government, and we've had a government for 10 years, which, in trying to control its fiscal deficit, has essentially been shifting its demand, its borrowings from the market to the lower end. And it's slightly cheaper, and so they're trying to save on interest costs. But the long-term structural damage to the economy is huge, and we're not talking about it. And I'm afraid a lot of, what you'll see is robotics coming in faster unless you get this corrected. This is a problem we need to tackle, and we need to tackle it now.
See, one reason people harp on this manufacturing sector, we have to, whether we can do exactly what China did or not, it's somehow the belief that manufacturing sector is capable of creating good jobs much better than service sector. I mean, India did Indian growth was led by service sector, and it really created very few good jobs right at the top, but did not really create a lot of good jobs at the bottom, right? And so, and yet now, now the question is, Ijaz Ghan, he has an article now in this World Bank report that you can have, that is the path for Africa and the newly emerging economies, is the service sector growth, and it's somehow capable of creating good jobs across the board, right? And so is this belief founded on anything real, or is just a wishful thinking?
Can I say something on that? Yeah. Because just going back first to the manufacturing and then the self. You have unorganized and self-employed, but I remember seeing a figure from the enterprise survey that 90% of enterprises are employing 5 people or less. Right. And I think 80% were family run. It's huge. Right. So, that, and most of these people are not able to grow. I think the question then is, how do you get that kind of growth? And I fully agree with you. It's electricity, transport, water, and the bureaucracy. I'm sure many of those, out of those 90%, can consolidate so that it becomes a much smaller amount, much smaller number. I mean, you don't need to start at a huge level and then expect these people to become labor. It's how do you grow the enterprises which are existing, which know the market, which have the skills, and consolidate. And I think that's, it's, the China model was huge, and so is Bangladesh, where you take very big manufacturing units. I think what we can do much better is consolidate what we have. So, look at it from that angle. And just an example of that is if you look at some of the artisanal growth, and I'm not, for example, metalware. Metalware, artisanal metalware has really grown. Of course, a lot of it is export, but a lot of it is in market also. So, and partly that is due to the growth of clusters. So I think, rather than think about a China model, which we are not going to be able to do now, we think of models where you grow what you have. And just one thing on the service sector, I've been very impressed with how Uber has just taken over the cities. And most of the drivers in Uber, right now at least, are earning much more than they were as drivers earlier. So,
Can I just comment on one thing? This, I know I've been a minority on this. I do feel the labor laws play a role for manufacturing sector. And Bangladesh, since you brought up, what is forgotten, Bangladesh has done very well, and some of these garment producing factories are sort of 4 times, 5 times the size of Indian companies. You know, historically, the interesting thing is India's Industrial Disputes Act is a 1947 act and pre-independence act. So all Pakistan and India inherited it. Pakistan got rid of it in 1956 for completely wrong reasons. They were having trouble with East Bengal trade unions, and it was very easy for them to just one signature by someone at the top, they got rid of it. Bangladesh is born without the Industrial Disputes Act because it's born out of Pakistan. It made amendments to Pakistan's very rough writing of that and got in a law which is very, very different. I feel it does play a role. And in fact, in some sense, the workers would be better off if this could be amended and done better. So I feel that is also a factor. And for Bangladesh, we do forget that there is this history which gives them a very different start.
You said you were in the minority.
I somehow feel wherever I argue, people disagree with me. So I just said that in anticipation. Yeah.
I'll disagree if you like.
I knew that also for sure. Yeah.
No, my only disagreement is that where does the Industrial Dispute Act, what labor is actually accessing the Industrial Dispute Act? It's not.
No, there is, you know, this is what Pronab will also tell me whether this is right or not. When I was in government, I would get a lot of this. There would be actual manufacturers would come to see me and say that, suppose there is a sudden fashion that picks up in New York. They would say that we can flood that market. We'll have to pull in a lot of labor, flood that market and get it. But the trouble is in India, if the demand then drops, I'm saddled with the workers. I can't do this upsizing and downsizing. I don't know whether that is a real reason or when you're in government, they give all kinds of camouflage reasons to get something else. But this I heard repeatedly, that we do need to be able to respond to global demand by upsizing and downsizing, which in India we can't do enough. So,
no, but that's what's happening. By you know, there's a bit of
yeah.
sort of double speak on this. The fact is, if you look at the growth of informal workers in the organized sector,
yeah.
That's the fastest growing component of Indian employment, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's
yeah.
what Ashok said. And
yeah.
that's absolutely,
yeah.
that's what's taking care of this problem.
I agree.
Right? The question is that what is the re-employment probability? Now that's, nobody's tracking that. I mean, have these people in fact become sort of quasi-permanent, except there isn't a written contract? I suspect it is, but we are not picking it up.
Possible.
Yeah. But that's something we have to look at.
See, in terms of, you know, what can be done and so on, I think in the December 7th issue of Ideas for India, there was a very nice paper published on Karnataka government's program of industrial areas. And it's an empirical survey where all the government did was somehow they released the land which was agriculture zone to industry, and so industry started, and the industry started, somehow the services came in, and it had a cluster effect, and so a lot of little businesses kind of grew around it, like in the unorganized sector, including in the farm sector, right? And then people from the farm families, they found employment in these nearby areas. I mean, the cluster effect was restricted to a small area, but there was a strong cluster effect. And then the wages they were earning, to some extent, solved the liquidity constraint of their homegrown businesses, and those businesses grew. And it's I mean, of course, you know, so all this happened because of rezoning of an area. So it wasn't government subsidy, it wasn't so on. In terms of what could be.
It may not have been government subsidy, but it is a government which has voluntarily given up on political rent, because rezoning is very rare. So what ends up happening is I, as the decision maker, have strike a deal with him, and I rezone his particular plot of land. So now if this is something that was done in publicly, then it's somebody voluntarily giving up rent. And that's always a good thing, whether in Karnataka or in Bihar, it doesn't matter.
This also relates to land acquisition for manufacturing.
Right.
It's a tricky, difficult problem, but if you just look at numbers, I mean, China was doing this mega acquisition going on, but by methods which are not possible in India, and even if possible, you should not imitate those methods. But you need to have some form. In India, it's left mainly to informal threats, and it's done in dreadful ways when it's done. I mean,
Like Singur and...
you sort of drive them out by frightening them, but eminent domain of some form is also badly needed to get the manufacturing sector going.
Also, it's very possible to pay fair prices.
Sure, absolutely.
That's very possible.
absolutely. I this fully agree.
But here's the thing, Renana, what is fair price? You classify your land as agricultural today, it'll have price X. You just reclassify, don't do anything else, just reclassify it,
That's right.
and it goes to 4X right away.
That's right.
Right away. Then you start, so now everything depends on when you acquire the land. Do you do it before rezoning it, or do you do it after? The implications are very different. And the beneficiaries are very different.
But when you do it after, that's when you get the political backlash.
This is the thing.
So you should do it before.
Yeah, because you want the farmers to get the gain rather than after doing it. Yeah, I agree.
I mean, many governments have.
Yeah.
And I've seen in Gujarat, they have been actually quite good on giving farmers fair prices.
Yeah.
On the fair price of land, nobody has answered the question very well because it's very difficult to do. But there, my favorite answer was given by this Parikit Ghosh and Maitrish Ghatak in a paper, and they had laid out a process as how you could come up with a fair price. It's too complicated to go through it now, but that is available on Ideas for India.
Yeah, and the fair price is important. I mean, it has to be a fair price.
What will the farmer do when they've lost their land? And again, it's the fair price question. If you give so little that you can't do anything, but just experience-wise, now this I've seen in Gujarat more than anything else, which is there are a few families who buy big SUVs and so on and just blow away the money. But there are a very large number of families who actually invest in other things. For example, invest in buying taxis and becoming a transport company. Many of them invest in becoming contractors, some of them become money lenders. So there's all kind of things that they do, and at least, again, my experience in Gujarat, and even, outside Delhi, the land that was acquired, people have got much better off than they were before. Can I take it to the urban areas?
Sure, please do.
Which is that, again, NSS data, it's really amazing. 80% of urban employment is informal, which is really bad. But I think the question is, which is, of course, the informal services, the construction workers, the home-based workers, the casual labor that's going on. So what are the urban policies one should be doing that would, I won't say make it into an organized sector, but would formalize, get better jobs, increase employment? And I think that's one area which, we talk about smart cities, but in the whole smart cities concept, and in fact, urban development concept, there's very little, or there's nothing on employment. So you look at housing, you look at water, you look at infrastructure, you look at services, to residents. You look at residents, but you don't look at employment. I think that's a huge gap in the whole urban planning. I mean, I can go specific, but I just wanted to put that out. That
yeah, but there's again a bit of a statistical issue there. And that is, what we do know is large industries are actually moving their operations into rural areas. Whereas the urban space is now being taken over by essentially small enterprises who wish to keep themselves informal. which is the less than 10 lot. So it's a sort of a relocation. So while a lot of the people that you say are informally employed, it's because of the nature of industrialization that's taking place in urban areas. In itself, I don't think that's a bad thing. I would much rather that happen than have the large Detroit kind of urban development. But the question that Kaushik had raised is how do you then encourage these guys to grow and formalize over a period of time? That's, I think, the bigger issue.
I mean, if industry won't go to rural areas, then at least, you can make the urban areas amenable to live, right? So
But the industry actually going to rural areas is important
Yeah,
because urban area, first of all, land comes with a premium. If you provide, again, infrastructure, transportation quick and all, for them the advantage is huge when you can go for mega development in rural areas.
It's happening already.
right.
But you can't think of, I mean, what you're saying is that urban areas then become residential and the work goes out. But I don't think that's really a possibility.
It's true in Africa, by the way.
happened.
Most African cities are residential locations. They are not
It's
work
true in
locations.
Delhi
It's
also.
true in Delhi also.
But,
Unless you count government as work.
well, that's true. But it's not true in Bombay.
No, it's not true in Bombay.
But I think, again, if you're looking at the informal sector, or if you're looking at the poor, or those whose the better jobs issue, you can't say that there should be no work and no employment in the urban areas. You can't do that. There's services in the employment area, in the urban areas. Then my favorite one, the street vendors. You have trade in the urban areas. The point I'm making is that the housing policies and the allocation of public land can really increase or make these jobs much better jobs than we have now. I'm not saying we can have big manufacturing. We shouldn't have big manufacturing in urban areas. But you can have services, you can have trade, you can have small manufacturing, you can have all types of services going from domestic workers right up to doctors and other professionals. So, but there's no focus on that. The policies don't.
That's exactly what's happening.
What?
Precisely what you described. It is services, it is small manufacturing. It's essentially what would get statistically classified as informal.
I fully agree. I think the point that was, the question that's asked is what are they earning? And can you increase that? Can you increase the productivity? Because they're all poor.
No, this is true. But then it really again comes back to the same old question that we started with, is what do you do to increase productivity?
Exactly.
And everybody has an answer to the manufacturing productivity part. Nobody that I know has an answer to the services productivity bit. How do you make a nurse more productive?
Again, it's human capital, really.
Again, it's human capital, but of a very specific variety. Today, you do know that our outturn of nurses from our current nursing establishment is less than half of what we need. So we have a skill development program that's churning out, unemployable skills. And the skills which are employable, for which there's a huge shortage, is being held up by all kinds of professional bodies who are acting as trade unions. Indian Medical Council is at the heart of all of this.
That I fully agree. Do you know what it costs to get admission? Informal cost to get admission in nursing school?
Yeah.